So welcome to this section on mobility. So this series will cover the basics of mobility training, the relationship between flexibility and mobility, the integration of the joint-by-joint approach, and will provide several examples of different types of mobility interventions for different areas of the body. So mobility training needs to be viewed within the context of the individual, what type of tasks they're having to perform, whether they be activities of daily living or athletic tasks, and how mobility at a certain area of the body impacts on those specific tasks. We need to understand the relationship between flexibility and mobility, in that passive range of movement assessments should be viewed as an assessment of one's flexibility, which should then be seen as the joint's potential to achieve mobility within a certain task. So the ability to achieve mobility depends not only on the flexibility, but also on the local muscular control, the coordination with different segments of the body, and the body's overall perception and response to positioning of a joint. So tightness or a perception of restriction in a joint in many cases may be similar to what we know about pain, in that it's an experience of the individual rather than simply a physical restriction. And because of this, we as practitioners need to find ways of tapping into this experience and find ways of modulating it for the client. Now, the optimal intervention to modulate this experience is going to differ from client to client, and this may be predictable based on their presentation and based on the assessments that we perform, but not always. And in that regard, we often need to perform some trial and error to ascertain that optimal intervention. So when we analyse a kinetic chain and its contribution to movement, we see general trends in areas that require mobility compared to those that require more stability. And this has previously been described by Cook and others as the joint-by-joint approach. And we can use the joint-by-joint approach as a very basic framework off of which to guide our mobility assessments and interventions. And we'll go through some of the concepts behind the joint-by-joint approach here. So in the cervical spine, we tend to see a requirement for more stability, particularly in the sagittal plane and particularly when we're performing resistance training exercises. With more complex movements, we may see more of a regional bias, as the lower cervical spine may require more stability and the upper cervical spine more mobility. Approximately 50% of the movement of the cervical spine should be occurring at the C1, C2 joint. We move down to the thoracic spine. The thoracic spine in most individuals is an area of the body that requires more mobility, and generally in all three planes. So we often require more sagittal plane mobility into extension and flexion, more so into extension, specifically when we're performing overhead tasks that involve a high degree of shoulder flexion. We need to see that thoracic range of movement contribution. In terms of the transverse plane and frontal plane movement, we do need to see again the thoracic spine being utilised as a centre of movement, and also as an area of force transfer from the lower body to the upper body. Now, there are cases, though, where segmental stability issues may be influencing the overall mobility of the thoracic spine. And Diane Lee refers to this as thoracic rings, so individual levels of the thoracic spine. If they don't quite move in sync with other levels, this may cause altered movement quality. The shoulder requires adequate mobility to perform the desired task, and especially if this is an overhead movement, such as a vertical pushing movement, we do need to see that there's adequate mobility there to perform the task. However, because of its inherent instability, it's typically an area of the body that we need to work more stability interventions. And often when there are range of movement restrictions in the shoulder, these are actually due to a guarding mechanism due to a lack of stability rather than an actual mobility issue. Most of the time, the elbow joint requires stability to transfer load from the shoulder girdle through to the extremities. In some cases, elbow extension may be lacking following an injury, and this may alter the biomechanics of athletic movement, and therefore movement may have to be modified if range of movement cannot be restored. So an example of this is maybe a radial head fracture or an olecranon fracture, where we are not able to restore that full extension, especially if the person has hypermobility. If they have hyperextension on the contralateral side, then there may be some asymmetry in the extension between sides, and movements such as a push-up may need to be modified to account for that asymmetry. Also, while gross range of movement restriction may be present after an injury, subtle restrictions not related to injury may limit range, particularly in movements requiring full flexion, such as a clean or a front squat, where the rack position is required. The wrist is often kept in a neutral position for many exercises, pushing, pulling. The large majority of exercises, we may keep that into a neutral position. However, for some exercises, such as a push-up or front squat or a clean, where we require that rack position, larger degrees of wrist extension are required. And if this range is not present, it may place excessive stress on the wrist or other links in the kinetic chain. So if we don't have that wrist extension and we're attempting to perform a clean, then that may put excess stress on the elbow or the shoulder. So we may have to employ some specific mobility interventions for our wrist extension, and if they're not successful, we may have to consider other exercise options or modifications, such as strap grips for the front squat, or handle grips or knuckle push-ups instead of a flat push-up. Similar to the foot, the hand requires stability in certain tasks, and as such, certain cues to increase stability in the hand, such as imagining shortening the hand or imagining eggshells underneath the hand, may be useful in creating stability in movements such as a push-up. We move down to the lumbar spine. The lumbar spine is an area that requires adequate mobility in all three planes of movement to perform daily function. In the case of resistance training, however, we usually want to see the lumbar spine as an area of stability. So we attempt to restrict the range of movement through the lumbar spine and allow force to be produced through the extremities. So an example would be a barbell backloaded squatting movement, where we want to see minimal movement occurring at the lumbar spine and see that drive and that force produced through the hips. Now, often pain in the lumbar spine can alter movement. So if one has pain in the lumbar spine related to movement, then they, as a short-term strategy, may attempt to restrict range of movement to decrease the pain and to allow a sensitized structure to settle. And as a short-term intervention, that's a sensible approach. Problems occur, however, when this approach is carried on long-term and the person develops an ongoing restriction in range of movement or hesitancy to perform range of movement, and this will then develop into a lack of capacity of the body to perform that movement when required. And because of this, acute lumbar pain needs to be managed correctly and needs to be rehabilitated to the point where the individual is comfortable moving normally again. By the same token, if one applies strength training principles to activities of daily living, then this can actually cause also aberrant movement patterns. So obviously, if we're lifting a heavy load, we do need that stability through the lumbar spine, and we may use some bracing techniques, or we may use a squatting type pattern to perform that movement. However, under lighter loads, and this may even be lighter lifting tasks, so if I'm lifting a 3 kilogram bag off the ground, I really shouldn't be doing that as a deadlift. If I'm sort of fixing my lumbar spine and bracing to perform that type of movement, then I'm using a suboptimal strategy. I'm using an excessive amount of tension, and I'm not allowing the lumbar spine to move when it really should. So because of this, normal lumbar movement patterns may be negatively impacted. So we've got to make sure when we are carrying out strength training interventions that we're also addressing the type of movement patterns that are being used in activities of daily living.